More from The Haunted Self, the Structural Dissociation book. This is kind of a lot of terminology, but it helps to explain things further on. So this is for my nerdy people. Synthesis involves binding together and differentiating among a range of mental and behavioral actions that constitute our internal and external world at any given moment and across time. Thus, our experiential world is not a given, but an ongoing personal construction based on our subjective appraisals. Synthesis provides the basic foundation for our normative unity of consciousness and history, which is further developed through higher levels of integration. Alterations of consciousness and dissociative symptoms can emerge when synthesis is incomplete. When an individual's consciousness is retracted or lowered, he or she may not adequately synthesize particular stimuli. He or she is not aware of a stimulus at all, or is only dimly aware of it. In dissociative patients, one part typically synthesizes certain stimuli that other parts do not. But when a dissociative individual also experiences a severe lowering or narrowing of consciousness, stimulus needed for adaptation will not be synthesized at all by any part of the personality. Synthesis that occurs in a given moment or event is called core synthesis, while synthesis of experience over time is called extended synthesis. Core synthesis involves binding together sensations, emotions, thoughts, behavioral actions, and a sense of self within a given moment or situation, but also differentiating them. In other words, adaptive synthesis in the moment must include essential internal and external stimuli and appropriate perception motor action cycles. On a broader level, it involves the immediate coordination and cohesion of action systems. Adaptive core synthesis provides the building blocks for synthesis over time, which is called extended synthesis. Failures in core synthesis may manifest as symptoms of structural dissociation or maladaptive alterations in consciousness. What we synthesize in a given moment or situation is strongly influenced by the action tendencies and action systems and their modes that are activated at the time. Binding or connecting together aspects of our internal and external experiences is one aspect of synthesis in the moment. The first step in binding goal-directed actions together as a whole involves connecting related but different perceptual actions. Much of this type of synthesis occurs automatically and unconsciously. For example, we typically automatically and unconsciously bind together sensations of movement and touch, temperature, taste and smell, and sight into one whole and higher order perception. However, this is not always the case. For example, when we learn new skills or focus consciously and with great effort on a paper we are reading, synthesis is far from automatic. Survivors may have difficulties even at the most basic level of synthesis. While some parts may accurately perceive and bind certain stimuli, others do not. This failure to bind perceptions that belong together into a whole may produce a variety of symptoms, including negative somatoform dissociative symptoms such as analgesia or kinesthetic anesthesia. Allie, a survivor who was repeatedly raped as a child, was able to have pleasant sexual feelings as ANP. However, when she initiated sex with her partner, an EP with no genital sensations became evoked, leading to sexual difficulties. This part of her never fully synthesized pelvic sensations because that region of her body became numb in her efforts to defensively respond during rape. We must also bind perceptions with our motivations and goals, and link those with the appropriate actions to meet our goals. And of course, some of our most powerful motivations are emotions, which must also be bound together with our actions. Dissociative parts that do not bind feelings as part of their experience can be emotionally flat or numb. Without much feeling to direct and motivate them, they often have difficulty generating enough mental energy and efficiency to act adaptively. Action systems must be linked together for synthesis to be adaptive. For example, dinner in company does not merely involve eating, which is a mode of the energy regulation system, but also seamless integration of actions related to social engagement, such as attachment and sometimes play, exploration, or even sexuality, such as flirting over dinner. However, we must also be able to inhibit action systems that are not appropriate to the situation. For example, participation in a dinner should not include activation of the defense system if no threat exists, and should not include flirting as a general rule. If such action tendencies are dissociated, an individual will have less control over their activation and inhibition. The stronger the integrations among action systems and their related sense of self, the more flexible and stable the personality, which promotes the best possible functioning in the present. Mary, a patient with DD-NOS, found it painful and frightening to eat in company and thus preferred to eat alone. When she did eat with others, she kept her eyes on her plate and did not join in conversation. She ate quickly and usually found an excuse to leave the table early. She had developed rigid and profound links between eating and defense because as a child, meals were fraught with violent fights, vicious ridicule, and sarcastic verbal remarks. Her family did not chat amicably or have stimulating discussions or laughter together, which would have been the action systems of social engagement, exploration, and play. So Mary never learned how to integrate these action systems together with eating. It was adaptive for Mary to engage in defense at the dinner table with her family, but as an adult, it impaired her ability to be social with friends. Our mental and behavioral actions must be linked with our awareness of ourselves, i.e., our sense of self. This sense is primarily dependent on developing feelings of what happens in or to our body in a given moment or situation. Even in core synthesis, which is what occurs in a given moment, we draw upon our personal history and genetic heritage to some degree, including our previous sense of self. Synthesis in the moment cannot exist without building upon some synthesis of the past that is at least held in implicit memory. A major problem for survivors is that their sense of self is too restricted and rigid within their dissociative parts, because it has been derived from a range of experiences and action systems that is too limited and excludes too much of the survivor's history. When survivors are unable to bind actions adequately with a sense of self in the moment, they experience symptoms of depersonalization. For example, when Allie touched her abdomen or genitals, it felt as though they belonged to somebody else's body. She knew they were hers, but they did not feel like hers. In sum, when dissociative parts can perceive feelings, thoughts, memories, wishes, behaviors, and the sense of self of other parts, but do not regard these as their own, they have engaged in insufficient binding. The same goes for parts that fail to synthesize external stimuli that really matter. For example, a part may see the therapist shift in his chair and perceive this as a sign of rejection or disapproval, but fails to perceive other signals that indicate that the therapist remains connected and empathetic. Differentiation. Adaptive core synthesis not only involves binding what belongs together in a given moment and context. We must also differentiate between what we perceive and what we actually do. Thus, it is important to know that our perceptions, affective feelings, thoughts, and movements relate to each other in a given moment, but are still different. For example, we must be able to distinguish between our own body and what is external to us, such as the chair is not a part of me and you are a separate person from me. This involves a very basic level of action tendencies. Survivors sometimes lack such core differentiation. When they confuse thoughts and objective facts, they may wonder, am I really at work or am I dreaming? Or they may confuse hallucinations with reality. My mother is standing there and she wants to grab me. They may also have difficulty knowing the difference between wishes and behavioral actions. For example, survivors as EPs sometimes believe that they have actually unalived their perpetrator when in fact they only fantasized about doing so. Attention helps us focus on, synthesize, and react to what is essential and exclude what is not. Attention is based on action tendencies and action systems that direct us in the moment. It thus includes our ability to ignore irrelevant stimuli that is essential to organizing our experience. This is a mental action itself, which Janae referred to as a reaction toward the insignificant. Some survivors are unable to engage in this important mental action of exclusion and inappropriately focus on extraneous details, failing to grasp the essentials of an experience. Healthy individuals can shift their attention as needed and therefore change what they synthesize depending on the demands of the situation. Survivors often cannot shift gears so easily. Dissociative parts tend to be fixed in a retracted field of consciousness, attending only to stimuli related to their action systems, such as defense. At other times, survivors shift their attention reactively and inappropriately. Some internal and external stimuli have a strong, natural, and universal potential to activate a particular action system, and these are known as unconditioned stimuli. These stimuli can evoke an almost instantaneous and adaptive shift in our attention and goals. For example, a sudden loud noise behind us will trigger an immediate defensive reaction. Survivors, as one or more dissociative parts, have learned to associate particular stimuli that were previously neutral to them with unconditioned aversive stimuli. Thus, the previous neutral stimuli became conditioned stimuli. Survivors overattend, that is, over-respond more generally to conditioned threat stimuli. Some, but not all, dissociative parts may have this attentional bias. Thus, one part may be triggered by a stimulus while another part is not. The degree to which survivors attend to a conditioned stimulus thus strongly depends on the probability that it signals an unconditioned stimulus. Thus, they can only estimate this likelihood by synthesizing and evaluating the conditioned stimulus in context, i.e., by knowing what is happening in the present. Survivors should learn to ignore irrelevant stimuli and stop a defensive reaction by inhibiting their defensive system when the conditioned stimulus does not signal threat. With repetition, their attention for a conditioned stimulus should become minimal while their defensive system remains inhibited. Extended synthesis. Many goals are not achieved in a single moment but entail an extended series or string of actions that must be synthesized over time. We refer to this complex mental action as extended synthesis, i.e., binding and differentiating across time and situations. Extended synthesis involves creating associations between related events and experiences, as well as distinguishing between them. For example, we bind together the differences of today and yesterday, but appreciate that they are different. What we view as related events is affected by the constellations of action systems we have created. A major advantage of extended synthesis is that it allows us to learn from our experiences and evolve ever more complex and creative solutions to life's challenges based on what we have learned. Survivors may be more inclined to associate negative relational experiences with many different people across time, and thus are less able to notice the positive relational experiences that happen in the therapy session. Our capacity to successfully attain different goals is at its best when we are continuously involved in the extended synthesis of our different action systems, and when we synthesize these action systems with our ever-changing internal and external environment. In many cases, we cannot pursue different goals at the same time, such as resting and working. This is because very different action systems tend to exclude each other, and because the capacity of our working memory is quite limited. Consequently, we cannot engage in a wide or complex variety of different action systems at a time. Core synthesis involves relatively limited synthesis of different action tendencies and goals. In extended synthesis, we bind together and differentiate a much wider range of both similar and discrepant actions and goals over time. Extended synthesis also helps us engage in highly complex actions. It helps us create our life history and a consistent sense of self because we are able to bind, differentiate, and coordinate not only a single action system, but complex constellations of them over long periods of time. For example, we can synthesize our interests and experiences as a parent, partner, professional, and friend across time as aspects of our whole self. Lack of synthesis explains a large degree of the survivor's seeming inability to learn from experience in various areas of life because experience has not been adequately synthesized. Different parts synthesize different experiences and goals across time so that they create not just a different view of the world in the moment, but also sometimes a different personal history, no matter how limited. And because dissociative parts are not totally separate from each other, they engage in conflicts that are fueled by the different goals they pursue and their different perceptions and experiences that are based off their discrepant core and extended syntheses. That is it for chapter 7. I have a collection for this book if you want to check out my other passages I've read of this book.